Hey guys, welcome back to the 16th episode of my poker vlog. I'm Huggy, and I recently had a local card room reach out to me about playing on a 1-3 live stream. If you've been watching my vlogs, you know that I've primarily been sticking to 1-2, and whenever I play No Limit Hold'em, I do play in the bomb pots, but I don't play above the 1-2 stakes. So I decided to try playing it without the cameras first to see how I fare. I'm going to the session with the idea that I should probably play a little bit more aggressively than I typically do. I also generally give people a lot of respect at 1-2 that I should maybe not be as willing to give at 1-3. That might not be true for some card rooms that run the 1-3 game, but since the card room that I go to, the Lodge in Round Rock, they play 1-2 and 1-3. The 1-3, I expect it to be a little bit more aggressive. So I put my name on both the 1-2 and the 1-3 lists just to see wherever I can get a seat first. Also, before we go into the session, I did put together a new card overlay that you're going to see. So it takes up less room, it shows the current game that I'm playing, it includes the stack sizes which weren't in there before, and it also allows me to share info about my opponent's hands, which I haven't done in the past, at least not visually. So let me know what you think of it in the comments. Otherwise, let's get started. Our name gets called for the 1-2 table first, so we'll just play there for a bit before we get called for a 1-3 seat. We sit down at a new table, and we're dealt ace-queen offsuit, and we're sitting in the cutoff. It's short-handed, there's maybe 6 players at this point. It folds to me, and I raise to $10. The small blind re-raises to 30, and I 3-bet to 90. I don't usually do this with ace-queen, but since we're short-handed, I decide to get a little bit more aggressive. My opponent goes all in for 164 total, and I insta-call. He shows pocket nines, so it's basically a coin flip, and we get to see a full run out. We hit Broadway on the river, and we scoop a nice pot early into the session.
Thank you. One's good. Checks. Table 16, please.
After about 30 minutes of 1-2, we get called for the 1-3 must move table. We rack up a small win of $81 at 1-2, and as I sit down at the 1-3 table, I see almost everyone has anywhere from $600 to $3,000 plus in chips. I also recognize the player 2 seats to my left as someone who frequents the live stream for much higher stakes, and I definitely feel a bit out of my league as I've got a measly $381. However, I'm going to stick to my guns with what I came to do. In the second hand at the table, I'm dealt 10-8 suited in clubs, and I'm third to act. It folds to me, and I raise to $15. Just the big blind calls, so we're heads up to the flop. The flop comes Jack 7 Queen with 2 hearts, so he flopped a gut shot. It checks to me, and a continuation bet for $22. My opponent thinks for a moment and makes the call. The turn brings a 5 of spades. We don't improve, and now there's 2 flush draws out there. However, when my opponent checks again, this still feels like a good spot to continue with the pressure since the board should hit my range. I bet again for $50, and my opponent folds before I barely get the chips out. We pick up the first pot we play in at the table, which definitely gives a little feeling of comfort coming to a new game. The very next hand, we're dealt Queen Jack offsuit. I'm sitting under the gun +1. I can't get the camera turned on before the hand starts since I'm still stacking chips from the last hand. I raise to $15 again, and both the blinds call. The flop comes 2-10-6 rainbow. We miss the flop completely, and it checks around. On the turn, we see the ace of clubs. We pick up a gut shot now, and the ace is good for our raising range as well. The small blind checks, and the big blind leads for $20 now. I call with position, and the small blind folds, so we're heads up to the river. The river brings the ace of hearts, pairing the board. My opponent checks now. It's unlikely he has an ace, given that there's 2 on the board. It's possible he could have paired the 10, but there are some missed draws, and the only way we're winning is to bet. I reach for my chips, and before I can even decide how many to pick up, my opponent throws his hand into the muck, so we win another one.
Thank you.
About 10 minutes later, we look down at pocket queens, and we're sitting on the button. There's a $5 straddle, and there's 1 caller. I raised to 20 with position. Admittedly, I probably should have raised closer to $25 or $30 given the straddle and call, but what's done is done. The livestream player 2 seats to my left now re-raises to $90 from the big blind. I've only got about $450 behind at this point. I could possibly raise to $200 or so, but I don't necessarily want to leave myself a single bet and give my opponent a chance to outflop me, so I decide to just chip it all in. He folds immediately, and we scoop a nice pot without seeing a flop.
I get no way.
I get a seat change for a better view, and about 30 minutes later, we pick up ace-queen suited. The under the gun player limps into the pot, and the player behind him limps in behind as well. The hijack on my right raises to $15. I decide to re-raise, making it $50 with my premium holding. The under the gun limper cold calls my $50 raise. The under the gun +1 who originally limped behind now pushes all in for $250. This is such an odd line all around that I feel like we're probably going to be in a coin flip scenario at worst against pocket nines or lower, or maybe even we're up against a worse ace. I decide to go with my hand, and I push all in on top to protect against the under the gun limp call player, who folds his hand. I ask my opponent how many times he wants to run the board, and we settle on running it twice. On the first run out, we hit queens full of aces. I still don't know what my opponent's got, but I'm assuming we probably win half the pot at this point. On the second board, we end up with aces and sixes with a king kicker. My opponent shows ace-jack, and since the board paired with the king kicker, we're chopping on this board. Overall, not a bad result. We win 3/4 of the total pot for $426.
Chop this again. Appreciate it, thank you.
Later that orbit, we pick up pocket deuces, and we're sitting under the gun. I raise to $10 and get 2 callers. The flop comes 6-9 king rainbow. When it checks to me, I continuation bet for $25. Only the big blind calls, so we're heads up to the turn. The turn brings the 4 of clubs. I don't improve, but when he checks to me again, I decide to fire a second barrel, and I put another $55 out. My opponent quickly calls again, so at this point, I'm probably giving up on the hand. The river doesn't improve us as it brings the 5 of hearts. My opponent checks to me a third time, and my hand beats my brain a little bit here. I had already planned to check after he called on the turn, and as my hand makes the check motion, I realize my opponent's talking to the floor about moving to another game, and is basically trying to grab a rack to head out. His behavior makes me think that he's lost interest in the hand, and betting here could probably have picked up the pot. We show our hands, and my opponent shows 9-7 off for second pair. We might have picked this one up with a large river bet, but it's a close call, and I'm not mad at myself for giving up, though I probably should have given up after getting called on the flop. A bit later, we look down and see ace-9 offsuit sitting in the small blind. This hand is a little bit weird, and I'm going to play some of the audio from the hand so you can hear what transpired as it relates to some of my thought process in the hand. The under the gun player straddles for $10, the under the gun +1 calls. The middle position player tries to just call for $3, not realizing there's a straddle. He tries to take his chips back with the intention of folding, but the dealer explains to him that he can't take his $3 back and explains his options.
Do I still have an option?
You can surrender the 3 if you like, but that's in there.
This player ends up making the call for $10 after all, so I call and the big blind calls as well, and we've got 5 players to the flop. The flop comes 7-9-6 rainbow. We flop top pair, top kicker on a pretty coordinated board, but I decide to lead out here for $25. The under the gun +1 player and the middle position player both make the call. The turn brings the king of spades. This is probably a blank for most holdings that my opponents would have called the flop with, so I decide to continue with the aggression. I lead for $65 now. The early position player flat calls, and the middle position player now pushes all in for $209 total. It's only $144 more to call to win $464 at this point. I'm thinking about the pre-flop action when the dealer had to explain the player's options and the player's intention to fold if he could take his $3 back instead of calling 10. I'm trying to place a range on my opponent's hand here given that. For hands that beat me, I think 8-5 is a possible holding for a flop straight, or 6-7 for 2 pair. But I doubt the 2 pair would just call in position on the flop and shove on the turn, so I'm mostly ruling that out. For hands that I'm ahead of, I think there are a lot of pair plus draw type hands, and now that there are 2 spades on the board, there are not just straight draws, but flush draw opportunities out there as well. I'm about 50-50 between whether my opponent has a hand like this or the bottom end of a straight in my mind, but given that I'm getting about 3-1 on a call, I only have to be right 1 in 3 times to break even here, so I decide to go with it. There's still the early position player in the hand. This is the player who cold called my $50 re-raise a couple hands ago, and I'm not putting him on a big hand here. I don't want to price him into calling as well, so I shove all in on top, and after a few seconds, we do see a fold from him. On the river, we see the 2 of clubs. Our opponent shows 10-8 suited for the flop straight. I'm actually really surprised by his holding here based upon his initial desire to fold this hand for $10 pre-flop, as it seems like a great multi-way hand to call behind here with, and one that most players that come here would be dying to get involved with in a pot. Unfortunately, we just have to muck here, and we lose a pretty big one for the night. We're still up overall, though, so we'll just need to take a breath and collect ourselves. The very next hand, we pick up King-Queen suited and hearts. There's 4 limpers, and I raise to $22 on the button. The small blind calls, the big blind calls, the under the gun player calls, and the middle position player calls too, so we've got 5 players to the flop. The flop comes 8-8 king with 2 diamonds, so we flop top pair, but any 8 beats us. I imagine we're either way ahead or way behind here, so when it checks to me, I check behind for some pot control. On the turn, we see another 8, the 8 of hearts. We've got top boat now, and we're only losing to quads at this point. The big blind leads for $60 now. The under the gun player calls, and I know there's not 5 kings in the deck, so I just call here instead of raising. On the river, we see the 4 of diamonds. The flush comes in, but it doesn't change anything. We've got 3 players in the pot, and only 2 kings possible as holdings in players' hands, one of which we're holding. I have a little bit of concern about someone holding the last 8 for quads given the scenario. However, both players check to me, and that mostly alleviates my concern, as I expect quads would lead or perhaps even shove all in here. Given that, I push out a stack of red for $100. The small blind folds and the big blind calls. They show king 9 suited for the same boat, and we chop the pot.
I emailed them and I haven't, like, what time or whatnot. All I needed
We get moved to the main table, and unfortunately, we're pretty card dead for 45 minutes until we pick up pocket king sitting in the cutoff. The end of the gun player raises to $20, everyone else folds, and I re-raise to $65. Just the under the gun player calls saying he wants to make the vlog and that he's going to crack my aces, so we're heads up to the flop. The flop comes 2-8 ace with 2 clubs. I'm not happy about the ace on the flop, but when my opponent checks to me, I decide to continue with the aggression and a continuation bet for $70. Unfortunately, my opponent makes the call. On the turn, we see the 10 of clubs. Our hand doesn't improve, and I don't want to bloat the pot at this point. When my opponent checks, I decide to slow down and check behind as well. The river brings the 7 of diamonds, which probably doesn't change anything. My opponent now leads for a big bet of $200. There are 2 scenarios that I think are likely here. A, my hand is pretty transparent. I've got a big pocket pair that loses to any ace, and my opponent is bluffing to get me to fold given the ace on the board. Or B, he's got a strong hand and wants me to make a call with a big ace. This seems like a smart thinking player, and I feel like there's a good chance he could be bluffing at the pot. I waver back and forth for a bit and take a long time coming to a decision, but I eventually decide on a call. Unfortunately, we see the bad news as my opponent flips over 5-6 suited in clubs for the turned flush.
Nice hand. Oh, I'm sorry.
A bit later, we pick up king-queen offsuit sitting in the big blind. It folds around to the cutoff who limps in. The small blind completes, and I raise to 20. Both players make the call, so we're 3-way to the flop. The flop comes queen 5-8 with 2 diamonds. So we've got top pair second kicker with a backdoor flush draw. The small blind leads for $35. I don't have much left, so I push all in for 114 total. The cutoff thinks for a bit, asks for a count, and ends up making the call. The original better folds, so we get a run out versus the cutoff.
Turn and river.
The turn brings the 4 of hearts and the river the 10 of clubs. I flip my hand, and my opponent shows he's also got king-queen for the chop.
I thought you were on the flush draw or something.
thin, long hair, and one of those.
15 minutes later, we look down at pocket king sitting in the big blind. An early position player raises to $15. The small blind then re-raises to $45. I push in for my last $153. The original raiser folds, and the small blind calls, so we get to see a full run out. My opponent announces he's got pocket queens, and I show my hand as well. My opponent doesn't improve, and we get a much needed double up from the previous pocket king's hand.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the middle.
Yeah, I'll take that, sure. Appreciate it.
2 hands later, we're sitting on the button. It folds around to the cutoff, the same player who had pocket queens against me last time, who raises to 20. I look down and see pocket kings for the 3rd time this session and re-raise to 65. The small blind says that's not enough and cold 4-bets to $265. The player on my right folds, so I push all in for 316 total. The small blind makes the call for not too much more. I show my hand, and we don't get to see his. We likely need to avoid an ace on this run out. The board runs out 8 high. My opponent shows he had ace king and mucks, and we get another double up. We're back in a good spot after losing that big hand earlier. The player on my right, who initially raised before folding, says he had pocket 10s and would have flopped a set, so we avoided some misfortune thanks to the protection from the small blind.
Thank you. I guess I'll give you those.
About 20 minutes later, we pick up 10-8 suited in clubs sitting under the gun +1. The first player to act folds, and I raise to $10. One player calls, and we're going heads up to the flop. The flop comes 9-6-8 rainbow, so we flop second pair with a gut shot straight draw. This hand feels strong enough to lead with after my pre-flop raise, so I make it $20. My opponent now raises to 50 in position. This is the same player who cracked my kings earlier in hopes of cracking aces for the vlog. I think there's a wide range of hands here that he could be raising with given the coordination of the board, especially if he thinks I just have overcards here, so I make the call hoping that he slows down on the turn. The turn brings the king of hearts. For all intents and purposes, this card feels like a blank. Most legitimate hands raising on the flop probably don't hit a king here. I check, and my opponent thankfully checks back. On the river, we see the 9 of spades pairing the board. This is actually a good card for us. It's less likely our opponent has a 9 now, in which case our pair of 8s could be good. I check to my opponent again, who now bets big for $100. This scenario feels similar to the last hand I lost against him, but the actions feel like they're telling me a bit of a different story. I think for a bit because there's part of me that doesn't want to make a bad call against the same player twice, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm good here, and I end up throwing in the chips to call. My opponent says good call, and I show my 8. He looks surprised that I called with such a low card, and he ends up mucking. It looks like our read was right this time, and we get a little back from the last time we lost against him.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
A few hands later, we pick up ace-queen offsuit sitting in the button. There's a $6 straddle, 2 callers, and I raised to $35. 3 players end up making the call, so we get to see a flop 4 ways in position. The flop comes ace-5-3 with 2 clubs. It checks to me, and I c-bet for $75. Everyone folds, and we win a nice sized pot with little resistance. I wish they were all this easy.
Thank you.
We're pretty card dead for about 45 minutes again, until we look down and see pocket 10 sitting under the gun. I raise to $15. It folds to the small blind, who then re-raises to 30. The big blind folds, and I obviously make the call for such a small price. The flop comes 8 ace-7 with 2 spades. My opponent checks now, and I think he probably has a pair less than ace at best, unless he's slow playing top set. I want to see where I'm at and perhaps win the pot here if my hand's good, so I put out a bet of 30. My opponent quickly folds, and we pick up another small pot, thankfully.
Can you chop one of these for me?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
A few minutes later, we look down at ace-king offsuit sitting in the small blind. The under the gun player raises to $15, the hijack calls, the cutoff calls, the button calls, and I'm out of position here, and there are a lot of players interested in this hand, so I want to make a big raise here to really charge anyone to see a flop. I make it $100. Everyone ends up making the fold, and we pick up $63 without even seeing the flop. Not a lot of play here, but it looks like the power of aggression is working. The very next hand, we're sitting on the button. The dealer announces there's a $10 straddle, and we look down and see pocket kings for the 4th time this session. It folds to the cutoff, who calls, and I raise to 40. The big blind, the under the gun player, and the cutoff all call, and we've got 4 players to the flop. The flop comes 2-6-9 with 2 spades. It checks to me, and I c-bet for $90. Just the big blind calls, and we're heads up to the turn. The turn brings the ace of diamonds. I'm really not happy with this card, especially since if my opponent was on a flush draw, they could be on the ace-high flush draw, which just hit the turn. When my opponent checks to me, I check behind for some pot control. The river brings a 3 of hearts. With the flush draw missing, I'll probably call a moderate-sized bet as a bluff catcher, but it doesn't come to that, thankfully, as my opponent checks. I check behind and quickly announce my hand, hoping we're good. Thankfully, my opponent mucks, and we scoop a big one.
Put out there.
Gangster fold.
Just 2 hands later, we're sitting in the hijack, and we look down at pocket queens. 2 players limp in, and I raise to 23. We get 3 callers, and we're in position headed to the flop. The flop comes ace-10-7 with 2 clubs. Not a great flop for our hand, and when it checks to me, given the number of players in the hand, this just does not feel like a good spot to continue. I check behind for a free turn instead. The turn brings the 10 of diamonds pairing the board. This board is looking uglier by the second. However, everyone checks to us again, so we might be good here. I check behind for a free river. On the river, we see the 5 of hearts. The flush misses now, and when it checks to us a 3rd time, I really think we might have the best hand now. I make a very thin value bet for $30. Everyone folds, and we pick up the pot without a showdown. This was a really fun and rewarding session overall. Playing at the higher stakes was definitely intimidating at first, especially since I was the short stack compared to everyone else at the beginning, but I thankfully ended up getting to sit at the main table with some really good people, really friendly people, which definitely helped to make me feel comfortable. We had a good time and walked away with a win. So we bought in for $300, we cashed out for $1,033 in the end. We won $81 at the 1-2 table, and we won $652 at the 1-3 table. After counting the 4.5 hours we played, there was $45 in expenses between the hourly rate and tips. So we saw a total profit of $688, which is not bad. Even though we won, though, I'm still probably going to stick mostly to the 1-2 limit for now. I've been finding that I like being able to play a little bit deeper stack poker, which I can do more comfortably at the 1-2 limits, given my bankroll at this point in time. But as long as things keep going in the right direction, I'll probably dip my toes back into the 1-3 game every now and again, and I'll definitely still be up for considering doing the live stream if that ends up being a realistic probability, or possibility, I should say. Either way, I appreciate you watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like and subscribe button. Until the next time, we'll see you then. Take care.